Is anti-globalism just anti-Semitism? A viewer named Jesse wrote to me about this, and I think it's a good opportunity to talk about whether this entire obsession that the right has with how globalists are bad, globalist, internationalist, Trotskyite socialists, unlike Obama, Trudeau, Macron. Okay, yeah, you get it. Whenever a right-winger or a reactionary talks about the globalist system and the globalists and all of it, they are often actually referring to the idea of a Jewish conspiracy to control this, that, or the other thing. Now, they use code words to mask their intentions, and many of the people touting this anti-globalist stuff don't even realize that it is a thinly veiled anti-Semitic conspiracy. Many of them are just regurgitating talking points that they heard from somebody else without even really understanding the origins or the oranges of so-called anti-globalism. Globalism exists what I mean is the idea of globalism as something separate from Jews are doing stuff does exist. Globalism is the operation and planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis, right? That would be when, rather than as individual countries, you have global economic planning. You have global foreign policy planning. That's a real thing in terms of it could be something that exists. Most of these right-wingers that talk about globalism don't actually give a damn about real globalism as I just described it to you. For many of them, it's just another way to spread their hateful ideology, to place a target on particular people, and it is often a thinly veiled placeholder for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's actually similar to, this is so fraught to ever mention George Orwell's 1984, because it's so often mentioned in ways that has actually nothing to do or have nothing to do with what George Orwell wrote about. But when you think back to Orwell's 1984 and you think about Goldstein as a tool to fuel hatred towards Jews, a bogeyman or a boogeyman, depending on your preference, anti-globalism has become a similar coded dog whistle version of anti-Semitism. And so it's a way that right-wingers can spread their hate and their intolerance under a more politically correct veneer. They claim to be against political correctness. They want to just say things as they are. Say things as they are for them would be to be going after Jews, but I guess they realize they have to be a little more politically correct, maybe, I don't know. And so they're calling it, we're against globalism, rather than we just have these conspiracy theories about Jews. We have seen this kind of talk before, and I know many of you know exactly where we have to go back to, and it's the 1930s. And we saw where it led then. Disastrous consequences for marginalized communities, including Jews and others as well. So what we really should do it's like, okay, David, great. Many of us suspected that anti-globalism is really just coded anti-Semitism, but what can we actually do about it? Well, one thing you can do is call it out for what it is. Anti-globalism isn't this harmless political viewpoint. It's a form of anti-Semitism with the potential to lead to terrible things. And just one idea for how to handle it is, when you hear these folks start talking about globalism, how globalism is bad, ask them to explain exactly which policies and initiatives they're opposed to. It's very easy for them to say, well, I'm against all of the ideology of George Soros and Klaus Schwab, for example. But that's not policy. Ask them for policy. Now, some may say, well, I'm against dealing with climate in a global way, like, for example, with the Paris Climate Accords. Okay, we could talk about Paris climate. But most of them won't actually have any examples of the globalism they claim to be against. And what's interesting is, and kind of funny and sad, for people spending so much time talking about globalism, you would think they'd be able to list at least a few globalist policies. But in my experience, I would be shocked if they can actually name a single one. Maybe they'll mention Paris climate. But of course, countries can just opt out. as Trump did opt out the United States during his presidency. So yes, anti-globalism, a very flimsy veneer for anti-Semitism.